Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation. I'm Bob Muckle. I'm the Secretary of Historic Boulder, and on behalf of the Historic Boulder Board, I want to welcome you to this second of our 3-lecture series for Preservation Month. May is Preservation Month. If you were fortunate to join us last week, you'd have heard Len Siegel's presentation on the progressive spirit of Boulder and its impact on mid-century modern and modern architecture. If you join us next week, you'll hear a presentation from Dan Corson on the early African-American residents of Boulder and where they lived. I'd encourage you to keep your eyes on our website for future presentations that we'll be offering throughout the rest of the year. Also, this presentation will be available in recorded form to anyone who registered and to members of Historic Boulder and to the wider community. Tonight, we're fortunate to have representatives from Right Relationship Boulder give us their presentation on Fort Chambers. I moved to Boulder in 1966 when I was 6 years old, went to first grade, and through all of my education in Boulder Valley schools, and I've never heard of Fort Chambers and its significance in Boulder's history and in the history of the Sand Creek Massacre. So I'm excited to learn what they have to tell us. I want to thank my friend Paula Palmer for bringing this or offering this presentation to Historic Boulder. So thanks very much, Paula, and take it away.
I want to say just a couple words about Right Relationship Boulder. We came into being 4 years ago when the City of Boulder, the City Council, approved the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution. And that resolution is about much more than a day. We do celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day in October, but the resolution really calls on all of us, on all of the institutions and organizations of the City and County of Boulder and ordinary citizens to lift up the history of Indigenous peoples in this land and the presence of Indigenous peoples here today, and take a second look at all of the ways that we talk about and learn about, and also sometimes learn very little about the Indigenous presence in this land over time and in our own lives. So as part of taking responsibility for that, we organized this all-volunteer organization of Boulder area residents, and we're trying to help the city implement the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution in a number of different ways. We have working groups that do different aspects of the work of our organization. One group works with the schools, and another group organizes visits and exchanges with Indigenous peoples who have lived here in the past but have been displaced or removed from this area over time. Another group organizes educational programs for ourselves as an organization and for the community at large. Another of the groups organizes the Indigenous Peoples Days events on the second Monday of October every year. And our group, the one that Christine and Tim and I are representing tonight, is called the Land Working Group. And what we are trying to do, hoping to do, is to welcome back the Indigenous peoples who have been displaced and essentially removed from the state of Colorado. Welcome them back in significant ways to have a presence here in the land that we now live in, and find ways that that they are able to be here however they choose to be here, and contribute in ways that they would like to contribute to our ongoing education and relationship building. So with that, short introduction to Right Relationship Boulder, I will start sharing my screen. We'll see if this works. Are you all able to see the quotation here? We want to begin this presentation kind of offering a framework that is represented in this quotation from Georges Erasmus, who is of the Dene Nation in Canada. He was co-chair of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And he wrote, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created." And now we're ready to begin the slide narration. Christine.
Across our country, people are re-examining our history and the ways we have failed to fully and accurately memorialize our collective past. Whose voices, stories, and images have been erased or denigrated? Whose stories have been sanitized and mythologized? In our public spaces, how can we reckon with the terrible injustices and legacies of slavery, genocide, colonization, and racism? How can we bring all our peoples and their histories together with a common commitment to truth, respect, and justice?
The Boulder Valley has been home to indigenous peoples for more than 14,000 years. They have hunted, traded, held ceremonies, raised families, lived and died here. People of many indigenous nations live here today. Their stories are embedded in this land. Those of us who live here today have much to learn from their centuries of experience and knowledge. It is time for our city to create openings for indigenous peoples to share their stories here in their homeland. We have a unique opportunity to begin this process now. In 2018, the City of Boulder's Open Space and Mountain Parks Department purchased a 110-acre property on 63rd Street between Valmont and J Roads. This land lies between Valmont Butte and Haystack Mountain, sacred sites to many indigenous nations. The new open space property has special and painful significance for the Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples. Their stories need to be heard and honored at this site.
The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie recognized the Front Range as the territory of the Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples. The Boulder Valley was rich in elk, deer, antelope, chokecherries, and other valuable plants. It was the winter camp of Chief Nawat, known locally as Niwot or Left Hand, and his band of Southern Arapaho. In November 1858, Nawat permitted some gold seekers to shelter over the winter in a few rough cabins that they put up at the mouth of Boulder Canyon, with the condition that they would leave in the spring. But on January 16, 1859, the miners found gold, and 3 weeks later, they established the Boulder City Town Company in clear violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty and their agreement with Chief Nawat. As Boulder grew into a boom town, the Arapaho moved their camp north and then east out onto the plains to avoid conflict. Although Boulder Valley settlers were never directly threatened by native attacks, they built a sod fort, Fort Chambers, to protect themselves. In 1864, a volunteer militia mustered and trained at Fort Chambers and then joined Colonel John Shivington's U.S. military forces to carry out the Sand Creek Massacre. More than 230 Arapaho and Cheyenne people, including Chief Nawat, were murdered at Sand Creek.
The site of Fort Chambers just north of Valmont Butte, is now City of Boulder open space land, and we are facing important questions. How will Boulder tell the story of this land? Whose voices will be heard? How can this land become a place to reckon honestly with Boulder's history and bring native and non-native people together to remember, to reconcile, and to build positive relationships today? Right Relationship Boulder is a local organization that is raising these questions, and we hope you will join us. The city's open space department is starting to develop a management plan for the Fort Chambers site. So now is the time for local residents and organizations to make our collective voices heard. Our first task is to learn an important chapter in our community's history through the lens of the Fort Chambers site and ask ourselves what this history means for us today.
So let's take a step back in time to the late 1850s, just before the Civil War, when Arapaho lodges dotted the land between what is now called Valmont Butte to the south and Haystack Mountain to the north. This was the winter camp of the Southern Arapaho peace chief, Nawat. Nawat was a well-known indigenous leader who consistently tried to reduce the potential for conflict between his people and white settlers. Early in his life, he learned to speak fluent English and traveled as far east as Missouri to see what the westward expansion of white settlement would mean for the Arapaho. Nawat's unwavering advocacy of nonviolence was a deliberate strategy for the survival of his people. As settlers repeatedly violated the terms of the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie, Nawat worked to calm the outrage of his young warriors. Even when minor settlers gang raped his own wife, daughter, sister, and other Arapaho women while their men were away hunting, Nawat refused to retaliate with violence. His reliance on the settlers' rule of law, however, proved to be in vain.
As civil war broke out in the east, hostilities, raids, and attacks between settlers and indigenous warriors escalated in the west. In the summer of 1864, Colorado's territorial governor, John Evans, issued a frantic call for volunteer Indian fighters. To avoid conflict, the Arapaho and Cheyenne peace chiefs had been moving their people away from white settlements along the Front Range. In the summer of 1864, to show his peaceful intentions, Chief Nawat put his people under the protection of Fort Lyon on the eastern plains. But the game was so scarce on that dry scrubland, and the fort offered them no provisions, so they were forced to move on. They joined their Cheyenne allies, who were camped to the east along the Smoky Hill River. There in early September, the Arapaho and Cheyenne peace chiefs parleyed for peace with the military commander in charge of Fort Lyon, Major Edward Wynkoop.
Lacking authority to negotiate a treaty on his own, Wynkoop accompanied a delegation of 7 Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs to Camp Weld outside of Denver. They hoped to secure a peace agreement with Governor Evans and the commander of the Colorado Military District, Colonel John Shivington. Evans, however, was already preparing for war, and he refused the chiefs' entreaties. But he told them their people would be safe if they would return to Fort Lyon and place themselves under the protection of Major Wynkoop there. By October, Chief Little Raven had moved most of the southern Arapaho to the south, away from the fort. But Nawat and his family of 50 or 60 people accompanied about 600 Cheyenne and their chiefs to Fort Lyon. Unexpectedly, on November 5th, Major Wynkoop was relieved of his command at Fort Lyon and sent off to Kansas. Major Scott Anthony took charge of Fort Lyon and moved the Arapaho and Cheyenne to Sand Creek, about 40 miles away. He declared them to be prisoners of war.
Meanwhile, in the Boulder Valley, white settlement was booming on land that was still Arapaho and Cheyenne territory according to the 1851 treaty. In 1863, settlers had built a sod stockade on the homestead of George W. Chambers, fearing Indian attacks, though no such attacks took place. The next year, when Governor Evans issued his call for volunteer Indian fighters, Boulder Valley men mustered and began military drills at Fort Chambers. They were designated as Company D of the 3rd Colorado Volunteer Cavalry Regiment under the command of David Nichols, who resigned his position as Boulder County Sheriff to accept a captain's commission. In late summer of 1864, the 111 men of Company D began training for war. In her biography of Chief Left Hand, Boulder author Margaret Cole writes about the men who formed Company D. She notes that many of them knew Chief Nowat and other Arapaho people personally. They had traded, negotiated, and coexisted in the Boulder Valley. It had been only 6 years since gold was found in the Boulder foothills when the Indian fighters of Company D rode out to join Colonel Shivington's forces in their march toward Fort Lyon and Sand Creek.
In the chill dawn of November 29th, 1864, the Boulder Valley men were among the 700 U.S. cavalrymen who attacked the Cheyenne and Arapaho people who were camped at Sand Creek, under the protection of the U.S. flag and a white flag of truce. For their first assault, Company D singled out Chief Nowat's Arapaho encampment. Most of the 60 or so Arapaho people in the camp were killed, although a few survived. Chief Nowat was mortally wounded and died a few days later. 8 Cheyenne chiefs were killed.
Soldiers galloped through the camps, rifles blazing, and they chased women and children for miles up the dry creek bed and across the plains. They brutally murdered and mutilated the bodies of more than 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Returning victoriously to Denver and Boulder, the soldiers displayed Native people's body parts as trophies while crowds cheered. Captain Silas Soule and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, who refused Colonel Shivington's orders to attack the peace camp at Sand Creek, became whistleblowers and sent an honest report to Washington. The details were so grotesque that even in the midst of the Civil War, Congress held hearings and determined that Sand Creek was a, quote, foul and dastardly massacre. However, neither these hearings nor an Army investigation resulted in the prosecution of Colonel Shivington or the soldiers under his command.
Of Sand Creek, the Native American Rights Fund attorney Walter Echo Hawk wrote, "The land can speak to those who listen. There is a bluff overlooking Sand Creek where you can hear women and children crying in the wind."
So why is it that most people in Boulder have never heard of Fort Chambers and our community's connection to the Sand Creek Massacre? History is written by the conquerors. The men of Company D and other perpetrators of the Sand Creek Massacre went on to become some of our state's most honored citizens. John Evans was pressured to resign as governor after Sand Creek Massacre, but he became a railroad tycoon once the threat of Indian attacks on the trains had been quelled. He also founded the University of Denver, and Mount Evans is named in his honor. David Nichols, commander of Company D at Fort Chambers, was elected lieutenant governor after he established the University of Colorado at Boulder, with money from Clinton Tyler, a militiaman from Black Hawk who moved to Boulder after Sand Creek. Tyler made his fortune cutting trees into railroad ties and built the first road up Boulder Canyon. David H. Moffett of Moffett Tunnel fame was in the 3rd Regiment and became a prominent banker and railroad man. Major Scott Anthony, the Fort Lyon commander, established a land title company and became a wealthy real estate developer.
And after Sand Creek, what became of the Arapaho and Cheyenne people? The so-called Indian Wars raged on the plains for the next 25 years, taking an enormous toll in death, misery, and loss. By the late 1870s, most of the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho were living in poverty on reservation lands in Oklahoma. The Northern Cheyenne, unaccustomed to the hot, dry conditions there, broke away and were eventually assigned a reservation of their own in Montana. The Northern Arapaho were resettled on a reservation in Wyoming that they were forced to share with their traditional enemies, the Eastern Shoshone. Over the decades, the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes have worked hard to build economic stability, provide opportunities for their youth, and maintain their cultural and spiritual practices.
But Boulder is still the homeland of these indigenous peoples. Northern Arapaho Business Council member Stephen Fasthorse told us, "The Boulder area was the chosen place for the Arapaho people in a spiritual sense. Our ancestors had a spiritual quest to search for a certain place, and when they came here, they knew that they had found it. It was told to us by the higher being of life. The Creator has always led our people. Our hearts always yearn for our original homeland. We hope we will be welcomed in this place that we belong to."
Boulder has benefited directly from Indian removal policies that violated human rights, broke government treaties, and forced Arapaho people from their homeland.
Those words are part of the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution that Boulder's City Council unanimously approved in August of 2016. The resolution creates an annual Indigenous Peoples Day observance, and it resolves,
Section 1, that those now living on these ancestral lands recognize that harm was done and acknowledge that we have a shared responsibility to forge a path forward to address the past and continuing harm to the Indigenous people and the land.
the resolution continues,
Section 4, City Council directs its city manager to work with city departments, Native Americans, and historians to correct omissions of the Native American presence in public places, resources, and cultural programming.
To help the city implement this resolution, a group of Boulder Valley residents formed Right Relationship Boulder. Our first action in 2017 was to visit the Arapaho people in Oklahoma and Wyoming. We told Arapaho leaders about the city's resolution, and we asked them how they would like to relate today with the land of the Boulder Valley and the people who live here now. They told us that they would like to have land in Boulder where they can honor their ancestors, teach their children about their history, renew their relationship with the ecology of their homeland, and hold ceremonies and cultural events. They would like to have housing in Boulder, where they can stay overnight on their frequent trips between Oklahoma and Wyoming, and also for Arapaho students studying at CU. And they would like to teach the people of Boulder about Arapaho history, culture, arts, dances, governance, and the issues that they face in their communities today.
Since our first visits with the Arapaho, we have hosted them here for Indigenous Peoples Day events and for a series of meetings with city, county, and school district officials. When the city purchased the Fort Chambers site in 2018, we took Arapaho leaders to see the property. Their eyes scanned the beautiful land where their ancestors had lived and where soldiers had prepared to attack them, and they fell into solemn silence. Slowly, Southern Arapaho Chief Elvin Kenrick sang a memorial song and blessed all the people who had lived and died on this land. All of us, his Arapaho ancestors, and the Boulder men of Company D, and those of us who live here now.
In January 2021, The city's Open Space and Mountain Parks Department began developing a management plan for the 110-acre Fort Chambers site. There may be different and competing views about how this land and its historic buildings should be protected and utilized. Already, the city has granted an agricultural lease for a portion of the land. To put this in perspective, the city of Boulder owns 46,000 acres of open space land. Of these, roughly 16,000 acres are leased for farming. The county owns another 66,000 acres of open space land, and 24,000 acres are in agricultural leases. The Fort Chambers site is only 110 acres. Right Relationship Boulder is urging the city to recognize the uniqueness of this property and its historical, cultural, and spiritual value to the Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples. We are asking the city to follow the direction of Indigenous leaders throughout the planning process that is already underway. We hope our city and Indigenous people together will be able to transform a site of racist violence into a place of remembrance, learning, dialogue, and reparations. We hope Fort Chambers will become a place where we can practice right relationship.
If you would like to join us in this effort, here are some things you can do.
Learn the history of Indigenous peoples in Colorado. One excellent source is Margaret Cole's biography, Chief Left Hand. Visit the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site.
Invite Right Relationship Boulder to give this slide presentation for your organization, church, or school.
Write letters to the editor of the Daily Camera, to City Council, and to the Director of Open Space and Mountain Parks. Advocate for Arapaho and Cheyenne people to guide the development of the Fort Chambers site.
You can follow Right Relationship Boulder on Facebook. You can receive e-newsletters or join a working group by and you can contact us by email at the address shown on the screen.
And participate in Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples workshop. Contact information is on the screen, and Paula can tell you about that.
So this concludes our slide presentation. We thank you very much for the opportunity to share the program with you, and we'd be happy to take some time to answer questions as best we can and hear your comments or ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you. I really enjoyed that presentation. I currently don't have I don't have questions actually in the chat box, so I encourage people, if you have questions, to put them up in the chat, and we'll talk about those. I'd be interested to know what archaeology has been done on this site, if any, to look for artifacts or kind of more clearly define the location of the fort. But hold that. So I do have a question, which is how long did Fort Chambers exist?
Well, I'll take a stab at answering that one. It was certainly built by 1863. Construction might have started in 1862, and the last continuous owner with the longest tenure on that was Paul Hummel, and he bought the property in 1920, and he said that the walls of the fort were still clearly visible when he purchased that land in 1920, and he identified where the fort was in his hayfield in 1967 to a Daily Camera reporter who took a picture of that, and that was about 2 years before Paul Hummel died. So we know it was there between 1863 and 1920, and for many years after that. We're not sure how many. There's stories about Paul Hummel digging presumably around whatever remains were there of the fort, and hitting a post that had belonged to the fort, and that's a story that Mary Wells tells as well. Mary Wells being Paul Hummel's daughter. Don't know what that year was. That post was given to the museum, but it was lost in a fire. That's all I know about that.
And to your question, Bob, the cultural resources coordinator or director or manager for the city of Boulder is an archaeologist, and his name is Christian Driver. And so we know that he is interested in doing non-invasive studies that might find some evidence, physical evidence of the fort or of munitions or construction materials that might be there. It's also possible that there would be objects that date back to the time when Chief Nawat and the Southern Arapaho were living in that area.
Has there been any kind of investigation of metallic, artifacts?
Not that we know of.
So I have another question, which is the city is currently building a multi-use path just east of 61st Street, north of the creek. Do you know where the fort is with respect to this path and whether there'll be signage along the path?
Christine and Tim?
I'm aware of that path going in. I don't know the answers. I think those are good elements to be raising with the city during their process. And maybe Paula, you or Tim know more than I do.
Well, one of the things that we have, that we are encouraging both the city and the county to do is to hire Arapaho and Cheyenne consultants and also local indigenous people who are living here today, hire them as consultants to inform a process of developing exhibits along trails. There are lots of trails in this area, and they do offer an opportunity for those of us who use them to learn about the indigenous history, their indigenous ecological knowledge, the use of plants, the languages that we know have been spoken here over time. And in our conversations with the Southern Arapaho, they have expressed really strong interest in offering their knowledge. They love the idea, for example, of having an app available to people who walk along paths in the county, an app where they could hear the Arapaho language spoken. So I think what this work that we're doing is opening up for us is many opportunities for Indigenous people to directly provide education through programs that could be offered by the city and the county.
Just as an aside, Historic Boulder is working on a walking tour of African American neighborhoods in Boulder. So the app that you use for this actually can have more than one app. You can have more than one tour created. So that might be an interesting collaborative opportunity. Mm. So I have a question that's related to an earlier question, which is just, do we know how long the fort was active? Go ahead, Tim.
About 4 months. It was used for the 100-day regiment. So not long, but it was a settler stockade similar to a handful that were built along the Front Range, one down in Church Ranch and Broomfield, one up closer to what became Longmont. They were often built near stage stops, and so the Tommy Jones stage stop which is not far from there, is actually part of that history because the fort or the stockade was likely built because of the stage stop. And also it ties in, the story ties in significantly because that land, that actual land, was the land of Chief Nawat's people for their winter camp. When the settlers arrived and pushed them out, built the stage stop, built the stockade. Then in 1873, former Governor Evans financed the railroad line, which is now an abandoned spur, but the railroad line that's right there and goes up the north side of Valmont Butte. So there's an awful lot of intact history right there. So 4 months is the answer, the short answer. You got the rest, right?
Yeah, it's always good to get the rest of the story. So the next question is, have there been any thoughts about what to do with the stone memorial at the Fort Chambers site? Would it be good to leave it and then erect another to correct the incorrect statement of there being an Indian uprising?
Well, our position in Right Relationship Boulder is that it's for the Arapaho and Cheyenne people to make that decision.
I should make note that the odds are extremely high that the monument's been moved. It was probably located about 1/8 of a mile to the west when it was originally installed, but that's another issue.
The question is, since I was trained as an or in graduate school in historic archaeology, are there any plans to do an archaeological impact statement for future development? Secondly, why this property and why not the land closer to Valmont Butte, such as the plot west of the former brickyard where there was a tiny log cabin we moved in the early 2000s?
I'm not sure I'm understanding that whole question. Tim or Christine, did you?
Well, I mean, the main point is that that Fort Chambers, having historic significance for a nationally important event of history, was there on the fort on the land that the city just bought for open space. I mean, the 1967 Daily Camera article with the photographer definitively shows where Fort Chambers was. So that's why we're not talking about it somewhere else. That's where Fort Chambers was, is on that particular piece of land out in that field.
I guess maybe I would also add that this is the moment when the city open space department is beginning to develop a management plan. So this is the time when we need to be working on what happens at the Fort Chambers site. But the Fort Chambers site is just one 110-acre property. And we are actually very interested in seeing whether other land can also be offered to the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other indigenous people. So we need to be doing this work right now because now is when the open space department is making these decisions. But we're interested in a much wider view of land that can and should become available to indigenous people.
So there's at least at the moment, a final question, which I'll just read because you may have just answered this, but in case it triggers any other thoughts, what can you say about the sacred site that is being mined on Valmont?
Well, Tim, I don't see you jumping at that one. The history of Valmont Butte is just so sad in so many ways. It's a sacred site for many indigenous peoples. And it has been mined, it has become a toxic waste site. And the city purchased it at some point along the way, and with what in mind, I actually don't know. I don't know either whether Indigenous people right now are advocating for any changes in what happens at that site. So I'm afraid that's as much as I can say about it.
So I have another question. I was a student in BVSD in the 90s and never learned any of this history. What kinds of plans are there to potentially try to get the school district to teach this in their schools? I think this is important to Boulder children to learn. And I'll just add what I said earlier. So I was a Boulder Valley School District kid from first grade through high school in a much earlier time, and also didn't learn any of this history.
That's true for me too, Bob. I started going to Boulder schools in 4th grade and went through Boulder High. And I didn't learn this either.
Well, and I'll just say, because I am not a Boulder born and raised, but I'm a Colorado born and raised. And I think the same is true for the Sand Creek chapter massacre itself. At least when I was coming up, was not at all well or accurately or completely taught. And I just have, and this isn't answering the question about the Boulder Valley schools, but I just will say that one thing I've personally witnessed over the last 20 years since the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site was congressionally authorized and has been established and is open to the public, the level of everyday awareness and knowledge among, I think, the average citizen has at least increased. I can't really speak to how much better it's being taught in the schools. I don't have kids in the schools, so I can't really relate that. But my hope is, and certainly Sand Creek is in the news quite, in the news quite a bit in one way or the other. And so that's the power of having the place preserved, if you will, for that type of learning and understanding and commemoration. And so, that's the kind of opportunity that Fort Chambers provides to connect some additional dots in Boulder Valley. Paula, you can probably say more. I can't speak very well to Right Relationship Boulder's efforts in working with the school districts because I haven't been very involved in that part of it.
Well, we do have a group that's working in general with the school district, and we have some teachers who are part of our volunteer work. But this is a prompt to me to welcome the kind of advocacy that Historic Boulder and that you as individual citizens of Boulder could very effectively take to the school district board and to the open space department, to the city open space department. As we said in this presentation, there may be a bunch of different ideas about what should happen at the Fort Chambers site. And we hope that people of Boulder, once they learn this history and understand the historical, cultural, and spiritual significance of that small piece of land for the Arapaho and Cheyenne people, we hope that organizations like Historic Boulder and individuals will get in touch with the open space department and let them know that this is important for not only for Indigenous people, this is important for the people of Boulder. It's important for us to have a place where we can face this history with open eyes and find ways to develop relationships that are based on truth and respect with the Indigenous people today. So we really welcome and encourage you to use your voices as citizens and as an organization, both with the school district and with the city.
That seems to me to be a really great summary of the evening. I'll say that Historic Boulder fundamentally believes in the importance of the preservation of place. I mean, that is the mission. And we're not exactly a history organization. We're an organization that believes in the preservation of place. And it's for a lot of these same reasons that, having an actual and preserved place is a place that allows education, that respects the past and respects the people that came before us and who in this case owned the land that we all live on. Or I don't think they actually had a concept that they owned the land, but it was their ancestral home. But there's multiple places in the community that have been preserved over time by Historic Boulder for these kinds of missions, and this feels like this could be another place where we could work together with other organizations. I'll say that we will send the recording of this event to everybody who registered for it, which means you'll be able to go back and look at the list of suggested activities, both for education and for advocacy. That was the last slide in the presentation. Unless you have any of the three of you have a final statement, I think I'll wrap up the meeting.
I just wanted to put in a friendly request. The little Tommy Jones stage stop is still alive and standing, last I checked, and it's pretty neglected, and it's right in the heart of the story that we're trying to tell here. And I was just hoping that maybe somebody in your group could recognize that that's part of this this story and maybe give it a little love. I'd love to see that.
We have interest in that. We haven't engaged with the issue really, but we're aware of and have interest in that site for sure. So, and someone suggested contacting Margaret Cole about this. So I think that's another good idea for outreach. So thanks everyone so much for coming. It's great that we had this output or this turnout, and I really appreciate our three presenters. This was extremely interesting to me, and I'm sure was to everybody else at the meeting tonight. So thanks everyone. Oh, and just an advertisement, a week from tonight, same time, Dan Corson's presentation about African Americans or early African American residents in Boulder.